Across icy caves, alpine ridges, misty waterfalls, and remote riverbanks, shadows move with purpose, footprints mark the land, and observation is far deadlier than confrontation. From the frozen Siberian taiga where a family's routine snowcat supply run ended in a silent frozen cabin to the dense black forest of Germany, where a night patrol vanished without a trace. In this video, we're telling 6 terrifying stories guaranteed to make you fear what's out there. The Siberian taiga felt impossibly silent on the morning the rescue team located the bright orange snowcat sitting at a strange angle near a narrow line of frozen birch trees. And even though the storm from days earlier had buried most tracks and crusted the terrain in hard wind-shaped waves, the vehicle still looked as if it had been placed there deliberately, creating an unease that settled over every person who approached it on November 20th, 2025. The Ivanov family had vanished 2 weeks earlier during what should have been a routine supply trip across the remote forest, and rescuers had searched hundreds of kilometers of harsh terrain without understanding how an experienced man like Sergei Ivanov could have lost contact so completely, especially while traveling in a machine known for reliability, heated insulation, and radio stability, even during blizzards. When they reached the cabin door and broke the frozen latch, they found Sergei, his wife Olga, and their teenage son Mikhail slumped inside, their bodies locked in rigid postures that hinted at sudden terror, their hands gripping the seats as if bracing against something that had towered over them, while their wide eyes, glazed with frost, stared into nothing with an expression that none of the rescuers could describe without feeling the cold settle deeper into their bones. The windows were coated in thick streaks of frozen breath, an unusual amount for only 3 people in a short time, which suggested to the investigators that all 3 had been alive far longer than expected for the cabin to have frosted so heavily after the engine had shut down. Yet none of them seemed to have attempted escape, a detail that troubled the forensic team as much as the faint smell inside. A damp mixture of musk and earth that did not match the snowcat's usual mechanical odor. The cabin showed no signs of a struggle, but several items appeared slightly displaced, such as a radio dial twisted fully to static, a small pile of emergency rations knocked onto the floor, and a single boot standing perfectly upright against the dashboard as if someone had placed it there with strange care, which added to the sense that something had moved within the confined space without leaving clear marks of its presence. Outside, the rescuers noted heavy snowdrifts that had collapsed around the tracks, but in sheltered patches beneath leaning trees, they saw large barefoot impressions spaced farther apart than any human gait, each print deeper than the surrounding melt. And although the rescue coordinator later said these could have been distorted bear tracks widened by wind and refrozen snow, several team members quietly disagreed because the shape had looked too defined, too symmetric, and too deliberate to be explained away so easily. Broken saplings extended outward from the vehicle at unnatural angles, as though something massive had pushed through them with slow intent. And nearby boulders, the weight of several men had been rolled into positions that partially blocked the narrow path leading toward the deeper forest, a detail the investigators noted in their logs without attaching meaning to it, since official protocol demanded natural explanations first, especially in winter, when shifting snow and ice often caused trees to bend and rocks to move across slopes. Still, a few rescuers wondered why the rocks were positioned in a neat line, as if forming a barrier rather than part of a landslide. Yet none of them voiced these thoughts in their final report, choosing instead to focus on the more measurable elements of the scene, such as body temperatures, cabin pressure loss, and snow layering. The forensic assessment concluded that the Ivanovs had died from hypothermia, complicated by acute stress response, which aligned with their rigid postures and the frost buildup inside the snowcat. And although the cause of stress could not be determined, the medical examiner suggested that the family might have been trapped during the storm, disoriented by failing equipment and overwhelmed by extreme cold after the engine stopped. A conclusion that satisfied official requirements even if it did not align perfectly with the strange details surrounding the vehicle. The radio had been fully functional during the last confirmed contact, Yet the final position of the dial made the investigators suspect that someone inside had frantically tried to find a signal, and the static might have disoriented them further as temperatures continued to fall, especially if the storm had intensified faster than predicted. The footprints outside were not photographed in detail due to drifting snow that began filling them shortly after discovery, and the rescue logs simply noted possible animal tracks, which prevented speculation from entering the official record, though several rescuers privately admitted that they had never seen animal prints spread in expansive arcs around a single point, so methodically, as if something had circled the Snowcat multiple times before stopping close enough for the family inside to sense its presence without ever opening the door. The idea that they had sat in the locked cabin, listening to heavy steps in the snow while wind howled through the trees, created a vivid image that none of the team could shake long after leaving the site. Residents of a small settlement 50 kilometers away had warned travelers for years that the taiga behaved differently during sudden storms, claiming that something enormous moved through the forest on those nights when wind drowned all other sound. But officials dismissed these tales as folklore reinforced by harsh winters and rough terrain. Still, after the recovery of the Ivanovs, more locals began avoiding the area during heavy weather, whispering that whatever circled travelers did not always leave once the storm passed. And even if these stories lacked proof, they gained quiet traction because the Snowcat's condition and the family's final moments left room for unsettling possibilities that no one wished to examine too closely. In the end, the Ivanov case was closed as a tragic weather-related accident. Yet the rescue team members who had stood beside the Snowcat on that silent, frozen morning carried with them an unspoken understanding that something had come close enough to be felt, close enough to leave impressions in the snow and tension in the air, before disappearing into the vast taiga without leaving answers behind. On March 14, 2024, a team of 4 experienced spelunkers descended into a frozen ice cavern deep within the British Columbia wilderness, unaware that their expedition would test the limits of fear and survival in ways no training could have prepared them for, as the cavern's entrance yawned like a pale jaw of translucent ice, swallowing the daylight and amplifying every sound into a brittle echo that seemed to bounce endlessly from wall to wall, creating shadows that danced even without movement. Samuel Treadwell, the expedition leader, adjusted his helmet light as it swept across frost-laden walls, revealing stalactites sharp as knives and an uneven floor glazed with slick ice, while his companions, Lena, Marcus, and Jonah, followed cautiously, boots crunching softly against the compact snow that covered the cavern's uneven terrain, unaware that the snow itself concealed impressions that had been pressed there recently, enormous and deliberate, far larger than any human foot. The first sign that something was amiss appeared when Samuel stopped to examine a deep depression in the ice, its contours resembling a massive barefoot print, toes spread unnaturally wide and heel deeply set. And the group assumed at first that it had been left by previous explorers or perhaps a fallen log pattern frozen in the frost, until Lena pointed out several more prints trailing in irregular but deliberate arcs along the cavern floor, each step appearing heavier than the last, and all seeming to curve toward side tunnels that led deeper into darkness. Unease began to seep into the team's consciousness, their prior confidence replaced by a creeping awareness that the cavern was no longer empty, that someone or something might have been tracking their progress from shadows too large to be human. As they moved cautiously, the low rhythmic thuds began, vibrating faintly through the ice, echoing from the cavern walls and side tunnels, barely perceptible at first but steadily growing louder, a cadence that matched no human gait and yet suggested intelligence behind its rhythm, deliberate and patient, as if measured in relation to their own footsteps. Samuel froze near a jagged stalagmite when a shadow shifted behind it, enormous and hulking, motionless at first but responsive to their movement, retreating just enough to avoid detection, leaving a bone-deep chill in the air that seemed to seep directly into their lungs. The cavern's narrow passages made it impossible to see around corners, and every sound, Every small disturbance of ice seemed magnified, turning even the lightest tap of a helmet against the wall into a booming announcement of their presence. Subtle disturbances of their gear began accumulating. Helmets that had been lined neatly on the ledge were now stacked in precise, unnatural arc. Ropes coiled in patterns too perfect to have resulted from careless packing, and several carabiners that had been clipped together now hung loosely in places that suggested they had been deliberately repositioned. Even Jonah's flashlight had been twisted slightly, its beam now angled across the cavern floor instead of illuminating the narrow passage they had just passed through. These minor rearrangements gave the impression of a meticulous observer, aware of every step, every decision, and yet careful to remain unseen. Its presence communicated only through movement, rearrangement, and the faint exhalations that resonated through the icy tunnels. The guttural noises began intermittently, low growls that swelled and contracted in volume as though the source was breathing deliberately, exhaling against the frozen walls, resonating in the hollow spaces to produce an almost musical rhythm that set the group on edge, their stomachs tightening and hands trembling despite gloves and layers of insulated clothing. Marcus, the youngest of the team, swallowed hard as he realized the noises were not random. They reacted to their movements, fading when they paused and growing sharper whenever they stepped forward, suggesting not only intelligence but patience and anticipation, an awareness of the human's position without ever revealing the creature itself. Panic began to overtake caution. Each step felt heavier than the last, as the awareness of being watched intensified, pressing on their minds like the weight of the ice above them. Samuel called a halt near a narrow choke point where the cavern constricted to barely shoulder width, and when he looked back, the prints they had been following abruptly stopped, as if the creature had vanished, leaving no trace, no disturbance in the ice except for a single helmet that had been dropped when Lena had stumbled, abandoned on the frozen floor as they fled. It seemed to Samuel that the cavern itself had become a trap, every turn of the passage designed to channel them forward, to encourage them to move precisely where the unseen observer wanted, guiding them with shadow, echo, and fear rather than force. The team retreated rapidly, boots slipping on ice as they retraced their path toward the entrance, glancing over their shoulders at the darkened recesses of the cavern and imagining hulking figures poised to strike, only to find each side tunnel still empty, silent, except for the low drip of melting ice. Outside, the snow returned to its familiar soft texture, and the cavern's mouth let them breathe the bitter cold of the forest air. Though relief was fleeting as Samuel noticed that the prints ended abruptly at tree line, disappearing into dense forest where no human could have continued undetected. The abandoned helmet lay near the edge of the opening, a small artifact of their encounter, evidence of a presence they could not identify, yet one that had followed their progress with perfect precision and left them shaken, aware that they had been observed without ever being confronted directly. In the days following the expedition, local guides who had worked the region for decades noted that certain ice caves carried reputations for strange occurrences, often involving missing climbers or unexplained disturbances of gear. Yet official reports chalked these events up to frost, human error, or natural ice movement. The spelunkers insisted privately that they had encountered a being massive enough to shift objects, leave enormous prints, and patrol the cavern with deliberate intent, unseen but unmistakably present. And their account circulated quietly among enthusiasts and researchers who recognized the description as consistent with other unexplained tracks and observations in the Pacific Northwest, a deliberate presence of intelligence behind every frozen wall. By the time the ice had begun to melt with spring thaw, the cavern had returned to its quiet, hollow state. But for Samuel, Lena, Marcus, and Jonah, the memory of low thuds, rearranged gear, guttural exhalations, and the shadow that had frozen them in place lingered far longer than frost on their boots, a reminder that some places in the wilderness were watched by creatures far larger and more deliberate than any human, leaving only prints, subtle changes, and the unshakable awareness of observation. On September 7, 2020, 4 hikers, Elena Ionescu, Matei Popa, Sorin Vasile, and Anna Dumitrescu, set up camp near a remote waterfall deep in the Carpathian Mountains, unaware that the day's light would fade into an oppressive darkness that would test their courage and instincts in ways no training or preparation could have predicted, as mist from the falls clung to trees and rocks, thickening with each passing hour, turning familiar shapes into shifting shadows that flickered and bent in the corners of their vision, blending with forms impossible to place. Matei, scanning the muddy banks along the tributary feeding the waterfall, noticed the first signs that something was wrong. Enormous barefoot impressions pressed into the wet soil, toes splayed wide, heels deeply set, spaced in wide, deliberate arcs around the tent, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them, had paused and observed before moving on. The curves of the prints forming loops that suggested not aimless wandering but methodical, calculated movement. At first, the group assumed they were old tracks left by humans or bears. Yet as their eyes traced the path, the pattern of encirclement became undeniable, and unease began to settle heavily in their chests. Small branches had been snapped low to the ground, bent at unnatural angles as though pressed aside by immense weight, and rocks along the banks were shifted with several crudely stacked into towers that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, each arrangement signaling an intelligence behind the disturbance, a measured awareness of the hiker's presence. The mist carried every sound in sharp clarity, and soon the rhythmic thuds began, low vibrations echoing through the forest in cadence with their movements, punctuated by guttural exhalations that rose and fell in a chilling, deliberate pattern, the resonance of a massive, unseen body moving carefully through the trees without error or misstep. Shadows flickered among the trees, tall and wide, moving with deliberate intent, as though observing, and each flicker drew the hiker's eyes despite their efforts to remain still. Elena froze when she caught a glimpse of a massive shape shifting behind a fallen log, its movement synchronized with the cadence of thuds, then retreating into the mist without sound. The awareness that something enormous was circling them without exposing itself pressed down with a weight that made breathing shallow. Each step toward the tent heavier than the last as adrenaline and fear churned in their stomach. Throughout the night, the hikers clustered close together near the tent, every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the mist, setting their nerves taut. Their gear seemed subtly disturbed. Backpacks shifted slightly, sleeping pads nudged as if brushed by a giant hand, and one water bottle lay overturned despite being placed carefully earlier. The pattern was clear. They were being observed, their positions noted, every move anticipated. Yet the presence never revealed itself, leaving only footprints, rearranged items, and a pervasive sense of attention that made the hours stretch into unbearable eternity. By dawn, the forest fell into uneasy silence, leaving a tension that contradicted the relative calm outside the tent. Elena stepped cautiously into the clearing and immediately realized her companions were gone. Matei, Sorin, and Anna had vanished, leaving behind sleeping bags, backpacks, and scattered supplies. No human trails indicated a hasty escape. Only the enormous footprints led into dense forest, disappearing beneath tangled undergrowth. The tracks suggested deliberate arcs, circling briefly near the pools by the waterfall before heading into shadows where searchers would later find nothing, as if the being had crouched, observed, and guided its prey before vanishing without a trace. Pools near the waterfall bore depressions large enough to suggest crouching or resting, with still water distorted slightly, indicating immense weight had been distributed with unusual care, leaving no splash or chaotic disruption. Search teams combed the area for days, following the tracks through gullies and steep slopes, yet aside from the footprints and scattered gear, no additional signs of struggle appeared. Investigators noted the precision of the tracks, their width, depth, and arcs, acknowledging the anomaly without offering explanation, officially citing the hikers as missing and attributing the disappearances to environmental hazards and disorientation in rugged terrain, leaving the true nature of the events unrecorded in formal reports. Elena returned disoriented, bruised, and exhausted, her clothing torn and mud-streaked from stumbling through roots and rocks while fleeing unseen forces, recounting in fragmented whispers the shapes that had circled them, the calculated steps, the guttural breathing, and the pervasive awareness of being watched. She insisted the prints were not human, that the presence had been deliberate, intelligent, and patient, maintaining distance, yet observing every motion. Her description echoed local folklore of the Carpathians, creatures that moved silently and deliberately through the dense forest, enormous, elusive, and seldom seen by anyone who survived their proximity. Over time, the campsite near the waterfall was largely abandoned, trails overgrown, rocks and branches returning to their natural positions, yet locals still warned hikers to avoid the falls after dark, claiming the mist carried deliberate sounds, the forest itself seeming to track movements of any intruder, and that wandering alone risked drawing attention from unseen eyes. Those who remembered the incident described it in hushed tones, recounting Elena's account of massive shapes, deliberate circling, and the precise, echoing thuds that heralded the presence of something far larger than human, leaving behind only footprints, rearranged objects, and an unshakable sense of observation. Even years later, the incident persisted in memory among hikers and guides familiar with the Carpathians, a reminder that certain areas of wilderness are not marked by human footprints alone, but by creatures whose movements are intelligent, deliberate, and terrifyingly patient, leaving behind traces and sensations that endure far longer than their fleeting, silent appearances. On January 23, 2017, helicopter pilot Marco Steiner began a routine survey over a remote section of the Swiss Alps, tasked with monitoring avalanche risks and mapping snow accumulation along isolated ridges, unaware that the flight would become an encounter that would linger in memory far longer than any ordinary mission, as thick clouds hung low, snow swirling in gusts that made navigation treacherous and instruments flicker intermittently, blurring the line between mechanical error and reality. Visibility dropped to near whiteout levels, and the familiar peaks seemed alien, sharp shadows blending with snowdrifts, each ridge and outcrop resembling forms impossible to categorize from the air. Around mid-afternoon, while scanning a narrow valley beneath him, Marco noticed a movement along a ridge that immediately drew his attention, massive and deliberate, unlike anything caused by shifting snow or ice. At first, he assumed it was an avalanche beginning to release or a landslide of loose powder and rocks. But as he focused, the motion revealed intelligence. Slow, deliberate, circling a small cluster of jagged boulders with measured patience, the momentum controlled rather than chaotic, leaving the surrounding snow undisturbed except for deep impressions that suggested enormous weight. Shadows among the sparse pines shifted unnaturally, forming a broad silhouette that dominated the ridge, its proportions far exceeding any human frame, towering and wide, moving with a purposeful grace that seemed aware of him above, yet never fully revealed. Compelled to gain a closer view, Marco lowered the helicopter, careful to avoid the ridge's steep drop-offs, and felt the rotors kick up snow and ice in waves that swirled around the ridge, momentarily exposing more details of the terrain. Beneath the swirling snow, he saw enormous barefoot prints pressed deeply into the powder, arcs intersecting, curving around rocks, and disappearing into dense forest at the ridge's edge, the spacing deliberate, each impression perfectly formed, suggesting a being careful to distribute its weight evenly across unstable terrain and moving with intent rather than haste. The prints varied slightly in depth, indicating stops, perhaps to observe, to crouch, or to shift position. Yet no evidence suggested a struggle or careless motion, only deliberate, controlled steps that dominated the ridge like silent markers of presence. Marco noticed additional anomalies along the ridge, small logs and rocks arranged in subtle patterns, some leaning against boulders, others stacked in precise, stable piles that would not have occurred naturally. The arrangements were minimal, but purposeful, a silent trace of passage or perhaps a signal of territory, small gestures in a landscape otherwise dominated by immense untouched snowfields. His gut tightened as he realized the ridge itself seemed alive with awareness, shadows shifting in ways that mirrored his movement, subtle forms ducking behind pines or boulders, reappearing as his angle changed, as if the being beneath was following him, observing his presence from the cover of snow and trees without ever leaving the ground. For nearly 10 minutes, Marco maintained altitude above the ridge, circling slowly, careful not to alarm the creature or destabilize the helicopter in gusts that whirled snow like powder storms. Every instinct screamed that the being could have moved faster, could have rushed to cover or attack, yet it remained deliberate and patient, each step measured, leaving only the enormous prints, carefully positioned obstacles, and the faint impression that the ridge itself was alive, watching and responding to him. The feeling pressed down like a weight in his chest, a tension that made every breath shallow, every rotation of the helicopter slower, deliberate, as though any sudden move might break an unspoken boundary. Uneasy, Marco climbed to a safer altitude, increasing distance from the ridge, yet the sensation did not diminish. Shadows continued to shift among the pines, following him, receding only when the rotor wash finally carried him past the ridge's crest. Even as he turned away, traces remained clear in his memory, the arcs of massive footprints, the controlled patterns of logs and rocks, the deliberate circles around the boulders, and the impression of something vast observing from behind cover. Silent yet intensely aware, no sound accompanied the movement, not even a snapping branch or shifting snow. Only the visual rhythm of deep impressions and measured arcs, which spoke volumes more than noise ever could. For the remainder of the flight, Marco's focus shifted between standard survey duties and the lingering sense of presence he could not shake. Even after leaving the ridge far behind, he found himself glancing at forests below, imagining shifting shadows in the snow and anticipating arcs of tracks that might appear if he descended. A constant awareness that he was being followed in some way, observed, catalogued, or at least noted by an intelligence far beyond normal wildlife behavior. Every clearing and ridge now seemed under scrutiny, each pine or boulder a potential cover for massive forms that could move silently and deliberately among them, leaving nothing but impressions, rearranged elements, and the unshakable sensation of observation. Landing safely at the survey base hours later, Marco recounted the ridge in detail to colleagues, describing prints, stacked rocks, circling motion, and the vast silhouette that had remained unseen, never audible, yet undeniable in scale and purpose. Investigators and other pilots suggested misinterpretation of snowdrifts, shadows, and wind-shifted powder, but Marco's confidence did not waver. The precision of tracks and patterns, the arcs around boulders, and the way the ridge seemed to respond to his movement could not be explained by natural forces alone. It was the kind of observation that defied standard explanation, leaving only the traces and memory of deliberate movement by a presence far larger than human. In the following weeks, alpine guides warned of that ridge, claiming it was avoided by hikers and climbers for reasons no one could explain, that snow shifted strangely, rocks were rarely found naturally piled, and impressions appeared that no human or bear could have left. Marco's encounter became quietly known among those who traversed remote ridges, a story of measured movement, deliberate circles, and a silent presence that watched, recorded, and remained unseen, leaving only footprints, rearranged terrain, and the lingering impression that some places in the Alps are not empty, that the mountain itself can be stalked by something enormous, intelligent, and patient enough to wait and observe without ever revealing itself. On August 12, 2021, David Langley and his 12-year-old son, Ethan, set up camp along a remote stretch of riverbank deep in Ontario's wilderness, seeking a quiet weekend of fishing and camping, unaware that the night would unfold into a harrowing test of endurance, perception, and instinct as the sun sank behind dense hardwoods, casting long shadows over the water and coating the shoreline in muted tones of gold and gray. While a stillness settled over the river, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint gurgle of the current over shallow rocks. As darkness deepened, the first unusual event occurred. Massive boulders, some large enough to require several men to lift, tumbled into the river from points unseen, splashing water high into the air. The sound amplified against the still banks and cliffs, startling father and son as if the river itself had suddenly turned hostile. At first, David assumed falling rocks from cliffs above, loosened by recent rains. Yet the spacing and timing of the impacts suggested something far more deliberate, calculated to command attention and create unease, the rhythm irregular yet purposeful, as if a massive presence was testing their reactions, observing from the tree line without ever revealing itself. Soon after, distorted voices echoed from the dark forest, faint but unmistakable, mimicking their own calls and movements as if someone or something had learned to imitate them, shaping tones that sent shivers down their spines. Ethan clutched his father's arm, eyes wide, while David scanned the forest edge with a flashlight, catching brief glimpses of movement among the shadows, shapes shifting just beyond clarity, tall and broad, retreating whenever he focused, leaving only an impression of immense scale. The rhythmic thuds began shortly thereafter, soft at first, then steadily pounding through the riverbank soil, measured in cadence with the subtle shifts in the shoreline, and every movement seemed deliberate, designed to draw attention, unsettle, and communicate presence without direct confrontation. Investigating the area cautiously, David noticed enormous barefoot prints pressed deeply into the soft mud around their campsite, arcs intersecting in patterns that suggested observation and calculated movement rather than aimless wandering. Some prints led toward the forest, only to return to the shoreline, forming complete loops, as if the unseen visitor was circling the camp, monitoring their actions, adjusting its position and maintaining careful distance. The depth of the impressions and the splay of toes indicated extraordinary weight and size, far beyond that of any bear or known wildlife in the region, and the precise arcs suggested intelligence behind each step. Subtle disturbances of their gear added to the unease. A cooler had been propped upright, facing the tree line. A lantern rotated so its beam illuminated the forest edge rather than the tent interior, and fishing rods that had been aligned neatly along the shore were now slightly shifted, as though brushed by an enormous hand. David realized these small rearrangements were not accidental, and that the presence had interacted with their camp deliberately, yet without causing chaos or leaving traces beyond these subtle markers of attention. The father and son remained close to the tent, speaking in hushed tones, hearts pounding with awareness that every sound they made could be mirrored or observed, every movement noted by something massive and intelligent. Throughout the night, guttural exhalations resonated from the tree line, low and rhythmic, rising and falling in patterns that seemed attuned to the campers' activity, while thuds from movement across branches and the soft splash of rocks in the water continued, sending ripples along the river. The father and son dared not leave the tent, pressed close together, eyes fixed on shadowed tree lines and the inky water beyond, noting each shift in mist and silhouette with mounting dread, while the rhythmic pressure of unseen steps communicated an awareness that nothing else in the forest seemed capable of, a patient intelligence tracking them without revealing itself. By sunrise, the forest returned to a deceptive calm. Rocks along the bank were undisturbed, the boulders had ceased their measured plunges, and the rhythmic thuds and guttural exhalations faded into silence. The prints remained in the mud, immense arcs intersecting across the campsite and leading toward the forest, yet every other trace had vanished. No limbs, hair, or other physical evidence appeared, leaving only impressions and rearrangements, subtle reminders of the enormous presence that had patrolled the shoreline with deliberate care, moving silently and observing without confrontation, its intelligence evident in every step, every manipulation of terrain and equipment. David and Ethan departed immediately, navigating the river trail with heightened caution, haunted by the sound of rocks crashing into water and the faint, musky scent lingering in the morning air. Every glance over the shoulder revealed shadows that might have been trees, might have been something larger, yet nothing followed directly. Still, the imprint of awareness remained in their minds, a sensation of deliberate observation that would not fade, a memory of a presence capable of measuring distance, circling with purpose, and leaving behind only calculated markers of its passage. Locals familiar with the river confirmed that the shoreline carried reputations of strange occurrences on calm nights. Fishermen reported rocks tumbling into water without apparent cause, unusual arcs of footprints in mud, and fleeting shadows among trees that seemed aware of human movement. Yet official explanations ranged from shifting debris to misperceptions in low light. Campers and guides avoided the stretch after dark, citing the possibility of a massive, intelligent presence patrolling the area, capable of mimicking sounds and moving silently, observing intruders while leaving only footprints and rearranged objects as evidence. For David and Ethan, the experience remained vivid, etched in memory by fear, astonishment, and the unshakable impression of being watched, circled and studied by something immense and deliberate, a presence far beyond human comprehension yet tangible in prints, subtle movements, and the quiet knowledge that the riverbank was not as empty as it seemed. Even after months, the echoes of rocks striking water and measured thuds haunted their recollections, a reminder that certain wilderness areas are marked not by human activity alone, but by beings whose intelligence, patience, and immense size leave traces of observation without confrontation, leaving only evidence in prints, rearranged objects, and the lingering weight of awareness. On October 19, 2018, 3 forest officers, Klaus Weber, Annika Schmidt, and Stefan Vogel, patrolled a remote stretch of the Black Forest late at night, investigating reports of illegal hunting in an area notorious for its dense undergrowth and treacherous trails. Unaware that this routine assignment would evolve into a mystery that remained unsolved and unnervingly vivid for all who heard of it, as the moon barely pierced the canopy and fog settled low, coating the forest floor in a damp, clinging layer of mist that muted sound yet amplified the smallest disturbance, turning each snap of twig or shifting shadow into a pulse of tension that pressed against their senses. Around 1:30 a.m., as Klaus scanned the path with his flashlight, their radios picked up faint, guttural exhalations, low and measured, that seemed to come from deep within the surrounding forest, distant yet unmistakably deliberate, a pattern that shifted in volume and rhythm as if aware of their positions. The officers paused, exchanging cautious glances, listening as the sound grew, accompanied shortly thereafter by heavy, rhythmic thuds that vibrated through the soil and underbrush, a cadence too measured, too deliberate to be natural. Every vibration resonated against the damp earth, suggesting immense weight moving with controlled precision among the trees, circling the patrol path yet never revealing itself fully. Despite the unnerving sounds, the officers proceeded, following the dirt trail winding between towering firs and thick undergrowth, aware that their radios now carried intermittent static, punctuated by subtle distortions that seemed aligned with each exhalation and thud, a pattern so precise it made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. Their flashlights illuminated twisted branches and low-hanging limbs, yet every shadow shifted in unnatural ways, fleeting glimpses of immense shapes disappearing whenever focus was applied, leaving only the impression of massive intelligence moving among the trees, observing, measuring, patient. Hours later, a search team found the patrol car abandoned on the narrow dirt path, engine cold and untouched, doors locked from the inside. The vehicle was angled slightly off the trail, resting on uneven ground as though a massive presence had influenced its final position. Inside, the officers' radios were twisted fully towards static, flashlights stacked upright with precision, and a small coffee thermos balanced delicately on the dashboard, a silent and deliberate rearrangement that suggested attention to detail and awareness of the officers' routines. Nothing else appeared disturbed, no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints other than the enormous impressions outside. The forest surrounding the car bore subtle but clear signs of intrusion. Enormous, barefoot prints pressed deep into the damp soil, forming deliberate arcs around the patrol vehicle. Some tracks leading into the dense timber and curving back toward the path before vanishing without a trace, leaving investigators perplexed. The print's size and depth indicated extraordinary weight, far exceeding any known wildlife, and the arcs suggested careful, controlled movement, as though whatever had approached had walked in calculated circles, observing and recording without risk of detection. Low-hanging branches were snapped and bent unnaturally, angled away from the tracks, forming irregular patterns that appeared intentional rather than accidental, and several small boulders had been rolled into the undergrowth, positioned almost ceremoniously along the patrol's route. The forest floor bore no other marks. No fur, no blood, no debris suggested a struggle. Investigators noted the precise control and patience required to move in such a manner without leaving additional evidence. The mannerisms of a being capable of immense strength, yet deliberate subtlety, leaving only traces of presence and the unsettling implication of observation. The immediate area surrounding the abandoned patrol car became a scene of meticulous study. Every impression in the mud was photographed and catalogued, yet no conclusion explained the officer's disappearance. The rhythmic thuds and guttural exhalations described by the team were consistent with patterns reported in other remote forest encounters, involving massive shapes, deliberate movement, and patient observation of human activity. Local guides and forestry workers speaking privately warned that certain sections of the Black Forest were avoided after dark, citing histories of vanished hikers, campers, and workers, accompanied by traces similar to those surrounding the patrol vehicle, with movements deliberate, arcs precise, and objects subtly rearranged. By the next morning, when sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy, investigators noted an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The patrol vehicle remained untouched, and aside from the large prints and repositioned objects, the forest offered no further evidence. No tracks led away from the site that could identify a responsible creature. No additional disturbances suggested the officers had been taken forcibly, and no witnesses had seen or heard anything beyond the fleeting guttural exhalations and thuds reported in their last radio transmissions. The incident quickly became a topic of hushed conversation among local residents and forestry officials. Stories circulated of shadows glimpsed among trees, enormous figures moving with controlled precision, and deliberate observation of human activity. Those familiar with the forest described the region as watched, patrolled by something massive and intelligent, a presence capable of moving silently, circling with patience, and vanishing before revealing itself directly. The traces left behind, the arcs of prints, rearranged gear, snapped branches, and rolled boulders, were taken as proof of intelligence and deliberate action. Yet no one could explain how such a being could interact with the environment so precisely without leaving more obvious evidence. Despite ongoing searches, Klaus, Annika, and Stefan were never found. Their disappearance remained unsolved, a haunting reminder that even trained officers, familiar with wilderness dangers and survival, could be observed, circled, and removed without struggle or evidence, leaving only signs of deliberate passage and calculated intelligence behind. Locals now avoid that section of forest at night, whispering of massive shapes that prowl silently, observing before vanishing, leaving unease and unanswered questions in their wake, a tangible tension that lingers over trails, ridges, and paths long after the forest returns to quiet. Even years later, the traces of that night remained in memory among those who patrolled or traveled the Black Forest, an unnerving combination of shadows, deep arcs of footprints, subtle rearrangements of objects, and the persistent sense of being watched, reminding all who ventured there that some corners of the wilderness are not empty, that intelligence and immense size can leave marks on the land without ever being fully seen, and that patience and deliberate observation can be more terrifying than any direct confrontation.